He had the city by the throat, a king holding court in a room full of cowards. But the moment the spilled champagne soaked into his bespoke Brioni suit, Amos Russo made the greatest mistake of his life. He looked at the quiet girl with the nervous eyes and tore her apart with words so sharp they left the entire ballroom in a dead, suffocated silence. He wanted to break her. He wanted her to know she was nothing in his world. What he didn't know, as she walked out with her head held high, was that he hadn't just humiliated a clumsy nobody. He had just declared war on the most terrifying family in the country. The air inside the Gold Coast room of the Drake Hotel tasted of old money, expensive caviar, and carefully concealed fear. It was the annual Chicago Harbor Charity Gala, a sparkling facade where the city's legitimate billionaires rubbed shoulders with the men who truly ran the streets. At the epicenter of this gilded hypocrisy stood Amos Russo. At 32, Amos was the undisputed head of the Russo Syndicate, a brutal and flawlessly organized criminal empire that controlled the Midwest's shipping lanes, construction unions, and underground casinos. To the public, he was the CEO of Russo Logistics, a sharp-jawed, ice-eyed venture capitalist who graced the covers of business magazines. To the men in the shadows, he was the Reaper. He demanded absolute perfection, absolute loyalty, and above all, absolute respect. Amos stood near the grand ice sculpture, nursing a tumbler of Macallan 25, radiating a predatory boredom. His right-hand man, Silas Montgomery, stood a few paces back, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Across the room, standing near the heavy velvet curtains, was Vivienne Sinclair. She didn't fit in, and she knew it. While the other women wore glittering couture gowns that cost more than luxury cars, Vivienne wore a simple, unbranded black slip dress. She kept her gaze down, tracing the rim of a water glass, desperately wishing she were anywhere else. She was only there because her roommate, Chloe, an aspiring journalist, had begged her to come as a +1 to help spot local politicians. Vivienne was quiet. She kept her head down. She lived a meticulously ordinary life, working at a small, independent bookstore in Wicker Park, eating ramen and taking the L train. That was exactly how she wanted it. She abhorred attention. The tragedy began with a laugh. A prominent judge's wife, dripping in diamonds and heavily intoxicated, stumbled backward while laughing at a joke. She crashed hard into Vivienne. The impact sent Vivienne stumbling forward, her heels catching on the thick Persian rug. She lost her balance completely, lunging forward with her arms outstretched to break her fall. She slammed directly into the broad, unyielding chest of Amos Russo. The sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot over the gentle hum of the string quartet. Vivienne's water glass had shattered against the floor, but worse, the impact had knocked Amos's crystal tumbler from his hand. 2 ounces of dark, aged scotch splashed violently across the lapel of his immaculate, custom-tailored Brioni suit, staining the pristine white silk of his shirt beneath. The music didn't stop, but the conversation in their immediate vicinity certainly did. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the surrounding guests. People actually took a physical step back. Everyone in Chicago high society knew you did not cross Amos Russo. You certainly didn't ruin his clothes in public. Vivienne gasped, her hands hovering in the air. Oh my God. I am so sorry. I was pushed. I didn't mean... Amos looked down at the dark, amber stain spreading across his chest. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. He slowly raised his dark, chilling eyes to look at the girl trembling before him. He took in her cheap dress, her lack of jewelry, her terrified, wide eyes. She was a nobody, a cater-waiter who had wandered off duty, or some pathetic charity case brought in for optics. You didn't mean to, Amos repeated, his voice dangerously low, a silken threat that carried effortlessly in the quiet room. I'll pay for the cleaning, Vivian stammered, frantically reaching into her small clutch for a napkin to dab at the stain. Or the replacement. I truly apologize, mister. Amos caught her wrist mid-air. His grip was like a steel vice. Vivian gasped in pain. Do not touch me, he hissed, dropping her arm as if she were diseased. He stepped forward, using his height to tower over her, his eyes blazing with an irrational, explosive fury. He had spent the entire week dealing with incompetent politicians and stalling union bosses. This clumsy girl was the perfect outlet for his tightly coiled rage. Pay for it? Amos let out a dark, humorless laugh that made the onlookers shiver. With what? The loose change in your pathetic little purse? This suit is worth more than your life, sweetheart. Vivian's cheeks flushed a deep, agonizing red. There's no need to speak to me like that. It was an accident. An accident, Amos mocked, raising his voice so the surrounding elite could hear every word. He wanted to make an example of her. He wanted to remind the room of the hierarchy. An accident is a misstep. This is incompetence. This is what happens when they let the trash walk through the front doors of the Drake instead of the service entrance where it belongs. Whispers erupted. Some of the socialites covered their mouths to hide their smirks. Look at you, Amos sneered, his gaze sweeping over her simple black dress with utter disgust. You don't belong here. You look like you dug that dress out of a bargain bin. You're a clumsy, insignificant little nobody who couldn't even manage to stand on her own 2 feet without ruining the evening of the people who actually matter. Tears pricked the corners of Vivian's eyes, burning hot against her skin. She had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, and now she was the center of a cruel, public spectacle. I said I was sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. Your sorrow is as worthless as your presence, Amos cut back, mercilessly. He snapped his fingers, and 2 massive security guards materialized from the shadows. Get this pathetic creature out of my sight. Throw her out. If I ever see her face in this city again, I'll hold the hotel management personally responsible. The 2 burly hotel security guards stepped forward, reaching out to grab Vivian's arms. Don't touch me, Vivian said. The words didn't come out as a panicked shriek, nor a tearful plea. They came out with a sudden, startling authority that made one of the guards hesitate. The tremble in her hands vanished. The tears that had gathered in her eyes receded, replaced by a cold, flinty hardness that seemed entirely out of place on the face of a frightened bookstore clerk. She straightened her posture. Suddenly, the simple black dress didn't look cheap. It looked like armor. She didn't look at the guards. She looked directly into Amos Russo's eyes. For a fraction of a second, Amos felt a strange, unsettling chill crawl up his spine. The way she was looking at him, it wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of someone mentally calculating the exact cost of his life. It was a look he had only seen in the eyes of hardened killers, not 20-something girls at charity galas. Vivian took a step closer to him, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. She lowered her voice so that only he and Silas, standing just behind him, could hear. You think you're a king because you can bully a woman in a ballroom, Mr. Russo, she whispered, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. But a real king knows the names of the monsters he shares the dark with. Enjoy your little kingdom. It's going to burn to the ground very, very soon. Amos scoffed, masking his sudden unease with a sneer. Are you threatening me, little girl? I don't make threats, Vivian replied softly. I leave that to my family. Without another word, she turned on her heel. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, their mocking smiles faltering as she walked out with the posture of an empress rather than an outcast. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply exited the grand ballroom, leaving a wake of bewildered silence behind her. Amos scoffed loudly, breaking the tension in the room. "Deranged," he muttered, grabbing a fresh napkin from a passing waiter to dab at his jacket. "Find out who let her in, Silas. Have them fired." But Silas Montgomery wasn't looking at Amos. He was staring at the grand oak doors where the girl had just disappeared. Silas was a man who survived by noticing the details everyone else missed, and he had just noticed something terrifying. As Vivian had walked toward the exit, 3 men who had been standing in completely different corners of the room had simultaneously abandoned their posts and followed her out. They weren't wearing earpieces. They weren't hotel security. They moved with the silent, lethal grace of highly trained apex predators. They didn't look at the girl. They looked at the room, scanning for threats to her. "Boss," Silas said, his voice unusually tight. "What?" Amos snapped, irritated that the stain wasn't coming out. "I need to make a phone call." Silas didn't wait for permission. He slipped out through the side terrace doors, pulling out an encrypted satellite phone. He dialed the number for their underground surveillance team. "It's Silas. I need a facial recognition scan pulled from the Drake's lobby cameras. Now. Timestamp is exactly 1 minute ago. Young woman, brunette, black dress." "Give me a minute, Mr. Montgomery," the hacker on the other end muttered. The sound of rapid typing echoed over the line. Running it through the local databases. Nothing. State databases. Nothing. "Run it deeper," Silas demanded, a bead of cold sweat forming on his temple. "Run it through the cartel and syndicate registries, Interpol, everything." A heavy, agonizing silence stretched over the phone for 45 seconds. Then, the hacker gasped. It wasn't a professional sound. It was the sound of a man who had just looked at a ghost. "Mr. Montgomery," the hacker's voice was shaking. "Are you sitting down? Just tell me who she is, damn it. There's no record of her in any public system, because her files are completely scrubbed by the feds and the 5 families. I only found a match on a restricted biometric server we breached last year. Her name isn't on the guest list. The girl Amos just threw out of the hotel? Spit it out. It's Vivian Romano. She's the blood granddaughter of Lorenzo Romano." Silas felt the air leave his lungs. His vision actually swam for a second. The phone nearly slipped from his fingers. "Are you absolutely certain?" Silas whispered, his voice cracking. 99.9% biometric match, sir. She's Lorenzo's only heir. The one they keep hidden to protect her from the life. Silas hung up the phone. He looked back through the glass doors at Amos, who was laughing with a local politician, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own death warrant. The penthouse of the Russo Tower overlooked the glittering skyline of Chicago, a monument to Amos's power. It was 1 a.m. Amos had left the gala early, annoyed by the ruined suit and the lingering whispers. He had stripped off the jacket, poured himself a fresh scotch, and was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows when the elevator doors hissed open. Silas practically sprinted into the room. His tie was loosened, his face the color of old ash. "What is it?" Amos asked, frowning. He had known Silas for 15 years, since they were running numbers in the South Side. He had seen Silas take a bullet to the shoulder without blinking. He had never, ever seen Silas look terrified. "We have a problem," Silas breathed out, bracing his hands on the mahogany wet bar. "A massive, catastrophic problem." "Did the feds raid the docks?" Amos asked, his mind immediately jumping to their business operations. "Worse. Worse than the feds? Silas, Makes sense. The girl from the gala, Silas said, looking up, his eyes wide and frantic. The one you humiliated, the one you called trash and had thrown out. Amos rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his scotch. You interrupted my evening for that? I told you to get the hotel manager fired. Why are we still talking about some nobody? She isn't a nobody, Dom, Silas yelled, the breach in protocol and respect shocking Amos into silence. Her name isn't Vivian Sinclair. Sinclair is a ghost alias. Her real name is Vivian Romano. The silence in the penthouse became absolute. The ambient noise of the city below seemed to vanish. Amos froze, the crystal glass halfway to his lips. Say that again. Vivian Romano, Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. She is the granddaughter of Don Lorenzo Romano, the head of the New York Commission, the Capo di Tutti Capi. Amos slowly lowered his glass to the table. His hand was trembling slightly. A cold, sinking dread began to pool in his stomach, spreading like ice water through his veins. Lorenzo Romano wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a living legend. They called him the Ghost of Manhattan. He controlled the entire eastern seaboard, the politicians, the judges, the ports. He was notoriously ruthless, old school, and unforgiving. He had wiped out entire rival syndicates over a perceived slight. And more importantly to Amos, Lorenzo Romano was the man Amos was scheduled to meet in exactly 3 days. For 2 years, Amos had been desperately trying to secure a peace treaty and a joint operational agreement with the New York families to open up the Atlantic shipping routes. It was $1 billion deal. It was the deal that would legitimize the Russo family for generations. The negotiations had been fragile, balanced on a knife's edge, requiring Amos to show absolute respect to the old-school Don. You're lying, Amos whispered, though he knew Silas would never joke about this. Romano's family is in Sicily. He keeps them locked down. He kept his daughter in Sicily, Silas corrected, pacing the room frantically. His daughter died. Vivienne is her child. Lorenzo moved her to the States 5 years ago, but kept her entirely off the grid. No social media, no trust funds in her name. She lives like a normal citizen, because Lorenzo wanted her shielded from the blood and the violence. She is the apple of his eye, Dom. He would burn the world to ash if anyone laid a finger on her. Amos felt physically sick. The memory of the gala replayed in his mind in excruciating detail. I said I was sorry. Your sorrow is as worthless as your presence. You look like you dug that dress out of a bargain bin. He had called the billionaire heiress of the most dangerous criminal empire in North America trash. He had physically grabbed her wrist. He had ordered security to throw her onto the street. I leave that to my family, she had said. Amos sank into the leather armchair behind his desk, running a trembling hand through his dark hair. The arrogance that had fueled him for years instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating panic. Who else knows? Amos demanded, his voice hoarse. Our tech guys. I put them on a gag order. But Dom, she had shadows at the party, 3 elite Romano enforcers. They watched the whole thing. They watched you grab her. They watched you humiliate her. You can bet your life Lorenzo already knows. The only reason we aren't dead right now is because they are probably flying their hit squads to Chicago as we speak. Amos stared at the skyline. The empire he had built suddenly felt like a house of cards. He hadn't just insulted a girl. He had insulted the bloodline of Lorenzo Romano in front of 200 people. In the underworld, respect was currency, and Amos had just publicly bankrupted the Romano family's pride. We need to fix this, Amos said, his mind racing, trying to find a tactical way out of a trap he had blindly walked into. We need to find her, before Lorenzo strikes. If I can apologize to her, if I can make amends, apologize. Silas laughed bitterly. Dom, you publicly crucified her. You think a bouquet of roses is going to stop Lorenzo Romano from putting a bullet between your eyes? Find out where she lives, Amos ordered, his eyes hardening with a desperate, frantic energy. Her real address. I don't care what it takes, Silas. Find her. I need to get to her before the sunrise, or tomorrow morning the Russo family ceases to exist. By 6 a.m., the Chicago sky was the color of bruised iron, shedding a cold, biting sleet over the city. Inside the Russo logistics headquarters, the atmosphere was even bleaker. Silas had spent the last 5 hours tearing through encrypted channels, burning through favors, and deploying every tracker they had on the payroll to locate a girl who technically did not exist. Finally, at 6:15 a.m., Silas slapped a thin manila folder onto Amos's desk. He looked completely exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes standing out against his pale skin. She works at an independent shop called the Bellwether Bookshop on Milwaukee Avenue in Wicker Park, Silas rasped, coughing into his fist. Lives in a second-floor walk-up 3 blocks away. Leases under the name Chloe Adams, the roommate she was with at the gala. Vivian owns absolutely nothing on paper. No car, no credit cards. She rides the Blue Line to work. Amos stared at the address. It was utterly baffling. The granddaughter of a man worth an estimated $4 billion, a man who could buy and sell entire city blocks, was taking the public subway and selling used paperbacks. Is she at the apartment? Amos asked, his voice tight. No. Our spotters say she left the building 20 minutes ago. She went to the bookstore to open up. She's alone, Dom, but the shadows are out there. Our guys spotted 2 black SUVs parked discreetly at opposite ends of the block. They have military-grade encrypted plates, Romano's Praetorian Guard. If you go in there with an entourage, they will view it as an act of war and gun you down in the street. I'm going alone, Amos said, standing up. He had stripped off his tailored suit hours ago, changing into a simple dark cashmere sweater and an unassuming black overcoat. He couldn't walk in there looking like a mafia boss. He needed to look like a man begging for his life. Because, essentially, he was. Dom, Silas warned, stepping in his path. You need to understand what you're walking into. You can't intimidate her. You can't buy her. You offer her money, she'll laugh. You threaten her. Those snipers take your head off before you blink. I know, Amos said softly, the harsh reality settling heavily on his shoulders. I have to eat dirt, and I have to hope she has a better heart than her grandfather. The drive to Wicker Park was agonizingly slow. The sleet had turned the road slick, but Amos's mind was moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. He parked his nondescript Audi 2 blocks away to avoid drawing the attention of the Romano security detail, pulling his coat collar up against the freezing wind as he walked the rest of the way. The Bellwether Bookshop was small, sandwiched between an artisan coffee roaster and a vintage clothing store. Its large glass windows were fogged from the heat inside, displaying stacks of classic literature and peeling posters of local poetry readings. Amos pushed the heavy wooden door open. A small brass bell jingled merrily overhead, a sound so aggressively ordinary it made his teeth grind. The shop smelled of aged paper, dust, and dark roast coffee. It was quiet, playing a faint, acoustic indie track over the worn speakers. Behind the scarred oak counter stood Vivian. She was wearing a thick, oversized, cream-colored knit sweater that swallowed her frame, her dark hair pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun secured with a pencil. She held a stack of hardcover books, carefully sorting them onto a display cart. She looked entirely different from the terrified girl in the black slip dress from the night before, yet exactly the same. She didn't look up when the bell chimed. "We open in 10 minutes, she said, her voice mild and distracted. "If you need an espresso, the place next door is serving." "I didn't come for coffee, Miss Romano." The heavy thud of a hardcover dropping onto the wooden counter echoed through the quiet shop. Vivian froze. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and lethal. Slowly, she lifted her head. When her dark eyes met his, Amos felt a physical jolt. There was no fear in her gaze. None. The nervous, clumsy girl from the Drake was completely gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the exact same terrifying, cold calculation as a seasoned mob boss. She looked at him not with anger, but with a profound, clinical pity. "Russo," she said, her tone flat. She didn't reach for a panic button. She didn't call out for her guards. She simply picked up a microfiber cloth and calmly began wiping down the counter. "You figured it out faster than I anticipated. I suppose Mr. Montgomery is as competent as his reputation suggests." Amos stepped closer to the counter, keeping his hands visible and out of his pockets. He felt entirely out of his element. In his world, power was loud. It was guns, suits, and screaming matches. Her power was completely silent, and it was suffocating him. "I came to apologize," Amos said, forcing the words out of his throat. It tasted like ash. He had never apologized to anyone in his entire adult life. "My behavior last night was inexcusable. I was stressed, dealing with union blowbacks, and I took it out on a stranger. I was completely out of line." Vivian stopped wiping the counter. She looked at him, tilting her head slightly. "Stressed," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were spoiled milk. "You were stressed, so you decided to publicly humiliate a woman you believed was beneath you. You grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise." She casually pushed up the sleeve of her oversized sweater. A stark, ugly ring of purple and blue marred her pale wrist. Amos's stomach plummeted. He had left a mark on Lorenzo Romano's bloodline. He was a dead man walking. "I am deeply sorry," Amos said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "Name your price. A charity donation in your name. A public apology. Whatever you want, Vivian, I will give it to you. Just please, call off your grandfather." Vivian let out a soft, dry laugh that sent shivers down his spine. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You think you can buy forgiveness, Amos? You think a check to an orphanage fixes the fact that you revealed exactly who you are?" She shook her head slowly. "Stress doesn't create your character, Mr. Russo. It reveals it. When you thought I was a nobody, you treated me like garbage. You only respect me now because you're terrified of my last name." Amos had no defense. It was the absolute truth. "I wanted a normal life," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I left New York to get away from men exactly like you. Arrogant, cruel men who think the world is a chessboard and people are just pawns. I worked very hard to be invisible, and you dragged me into the spotlight." "I will fix it," Amos pleaded, stepping closer, gripping the edge of the counter. "I will scrub the footage. I will ensure no one speaks of it. I can make this right, Vivian." "You can't," she replied simply, her eyes dropping to the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the shop. "Because you're too late." Amos frowned, confusion momentarily cutting through his panic. "Too late for what?" "You think you're here to save your life by negotiating with me," Vivian said softly, meeting his gaze with a chilling finality. "But you're already dead, Amos." "My grandfather didn't wait for my phone call. His security detail reported the incident at 11:30 p.m. last night." She paused, watching the color drain entirely from Amos's face. "Lorenzo's private jet landed at Chicago O'Hare 45 minutes ago," she whispered. He isn't coming for a peace treaty anymore. He's coming for you." The drive back to the Russo Logistics headquarters was a blur of pure adrenaline and dread. Amos broke every traffic law in the city of Chicago, his Audi tearing through the slush-covered streets. He dialed Silas, but the call went straight to an encrypted voicemail. He dialed his head of security. Voicemail. He dialed his secondary port supervisor. Nothing but dead air. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar companion, clawed at Amos's throat. His syndicate was a fortress. He had 200 armed men on the payroll, state-of-the-art surveillance, and off-duty cops guarding his properties. It was impossible for his entire communications network to go dark simultaneously. Unless the ghost of Manhattan had arrived. Amos slammed his car into the underground executive garage of his headquarters. He jumped out, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock 19, holstered at his lower back. The garage was entirely empty. His detail's vehicles were there, but the men were gone. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just an eerie, echoing emptiness. He moved toward the private elevator, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swiped his biometric access card. The light flashed green, and the doors slid open. As the elevator ascended to the top floor, Amos tried to formulate a plan. Lorenzo Romano was old school. He respected strength, but he demanded blood for blood. Amos had to offer a sacrifice. Money, territory, shipping routes. He would give up half his empire if it meant keeping his life. The elevator dinged softly, opening into the expansive glass-walled penthouse office. Amos stepped out, his hand hovering near his waist. The first thing he noticed was Silas. His loyal right-hand man was sitting in a leather chair in the corner of the room. He wasn't dead, but he looked like he wished he was. 3 massive men in tailored Italian suits stood behind him, their hands resting casually over the lapels of their jackets. They didn't even look at Amos. Their discipline was terrifying. The second thing Amos noticed was the man sitting behind his desk. Lorenzo Romano did not look like a monster. He looked like an aristocratic European grandfather. At 72, he possessed a thick mane of silver hair and wore a bespoke, 3-piece charcoal suit that fit him with agonizing perfection. A vintage gold Patek Philippe watch caught the morning light as he slowly stirred a cup of espresso. He looked utterly relaxed, a king resting on a conquered throne. Beside him stood Matteo, Lorenzo's infamous enforcer, a man rumored to have dismantled an entire Colombian cartel faction with a single strike team. Matteo's dead, shark-like eyes tracked Amos's every micro-movement. "Amos Russo," Lorenzo said. His voice was a rich, gravelly baritone, lightly dusted with a Sicilian accent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quietness of his tone demanded absolute obedience. "Don Lorenzo," Amos replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. He slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty, and kept them away from his weapon. He took a hesitant step forward into his own office. "I wasn't expecting you until Tuesday." "Plans change," Lorenzo said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his espresso. He grimaced slightly. "Your coffee is bitter, Amos. Much like your hospitality." "I can explain what happened last night," Amos said quickly, knowing he had to seize the narrative before Lorenzo passed a sentence. "It was a catastrophic misunderstanding. I did not know who she was." "Stop!" Lorenzo didn't yell. He just said the word, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amos's jaw snapped shut. Lorenzo slowly placed the espresso cup down on a coaster. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk, clasping his hands together. His pale blue eyes locked onto Amos, pinning him in place like an insect on a board. "You did not know who she was," Lorenzo repeated, the words rolling off his tongue with a dangerous softness. "Let us examine that defense, Amos. You did not know she was a Romano. You thought she was a nobody, a civilian, a working-class girl in a cheap dress. Lorenzo stood up slowly. Despite his age, he moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. He walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from Amos. The older man was slightly shorter, but Amos felt completely dwarfed by his presence. "And because you thought she was a nobody," Lorenzo whispered, his voice vibrating with barely contained violence, "you believed it was your right to publicly humiliate her. You grabbed her. My men tell me you left a bruise on her wrist, the wrist of my blood, the wrist of the girl I have spent 5 years hiding from the darkness of our world, only for you to drag her into the mud for your own amusement." Amos swallowed hard. "I will make reparations, whatever the commission demands. Shipping routes, a percentage of the Chicago docks." Lorenzo let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a terrifying sound. "Reparations?" Lorenzo turned to Matteo, smiling coldly. "He offers me docks. He offers me water and concrete to pay for the tears of my granddaughter." Lorenzo turned back to Amos, the smile vanishing instantly. "I have more money than God, Amos. I own the politicians who write the laws you break. I do not want your territory. I want your respect. And since you clearly have none to give, I will take your life." Matteo shifted slightly, his hand sliding inside his jacket. "Wait!" Amos choked out, his survival instinct overriding his pride. "Please, I spoke to Vivian this morning." Lorenzo halted, raising a silver eyebrow. Matteo paused. "You went to her shop?" Lorenzo asked, a dangerous edge returning to his voice. "You went near her again?" "I went to apologize," Amos said rapidly, his chest heaving. "Alone, unarmed. I went to beg for her forgiveness. She is stronger than you think, Don Lorenzo. She wasn't intimidated by me. She told me exactly what I was." Lorenzo stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of the Patek Philippe watch. "My granddaughter," Lorenzo finally said, his voice softening just a fraction, "has the heart of an angel and the mind of a general. She despises the violence of our life. It is the only reason you are currently breathing, Amos." Lorenzo walked back to the desk and picked up his cane, a polished ebony stick with a silver wolf's head. "I was going to have Matteo put a bullet in your stomach and let you bleed out on this expensive rug," Lorenzo stated factually. "But Vivian called me while I was in the car. She asked me not to kill you." Amos felt a massive, shuddering wave of relief wash over him. His knees nearly buckled. She had saved him. "Do not celebrate yet, boy," Lorenzo warned, catching the shift in Amos's posture. "She asked me not to kill you because she doesn't want Chicago to dissolve into a bloody gang war. She is protecting the city, not you. However, an insult to the Romano family cannot go unanswered. If I let you walk away, the other families will see it as weakness." "What do you want me to do?" Amos asked, fully prepared to hand over his entire bank account. Lorenzo smiled. It was a cruel, devastating expression. "You humiliated her in front of the elite of Chicago. You stripped her of her dignity," Lorenzo said. "So, you will restore it, in front of the exact same people. You will prove to me that you are capable of genuine humility, or I will let Matteo finish what we started." "How?" Amos asked, a knot of fresh dread forming in his stomach. "The mayor's platinum gala is tomorrow night at the Field Museum," Lorenzo said, adjusting his cuffs. "Everyone who was at the Drake will be there. You will attend, and you will bring Vivian as your honored guest. You will treat her like a queen. You will publicly apologize to her in front of the entire ballroom." Amos stared at him, stunned. "You want me to take her on a date?" I want you to bow before her, Lorenzo corrected coldly. I want every single person in that room to know that you are beneath her. And if she is unhappy for even a single second, if you fail to show her the utmost respect, my snipers will be in the museum rafters. Lorenzo walked toward the private elevator, Matteo and the guards falling in seamlessly behind him. She is expecting you at 8 o'clock tomorrow, Amos, Lorenzo said over his shoulder as the elevator doors opened. Do not be late, and do not disappoint her. You will only get one chance to keep your head. The doors closed, leaving Amos standing in his own office, a hostage in his own empire, realizing the true torture had only just begun. At 7:55 p.m., a fleet of 3 jet-black Maybachs idled softly outside the unassuming brick walk-up in Wicker Park. The sleet had stopped, leaving the Chicago streets glittering like shattered glass under the amber streetlights. Amos Russo stood on the pavement, the biting wind tugging at the lapels of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. For the first time in his reign as the head of the Russo syndicate, his palms were sweating. He was flanked by Silas and 4 of his most elite guards, though they all knew their presence was purely ceremonial. Up on the rooftops, hidden in the shadows of the adjacent buildings, Lorenzo Romano's snipers had their crosshairs fixed precisely on Amos's chest. He could feel the heavy, invisible weight of their optics. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect, and he would drop dead on the freezing pavement. At exactly 8 p.m., the heavy wooden door of the apartment building opened. Amos's breath hitched, the cold air suddenly catching in his throat. Vivian stepped out into the night, and she was a revelation. The oversized knit sweaters and cheap slip dresses were gone. Tonight, the heir to the Romano Empire wore a breathtaking, floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet, custom-tailored by Ralph Lauren. It hugged her frame elegantly, the deep color making her pale skin luminous. A single, flawless diamond choker rested at her throat, a subtle, multi-million-dollar whisper of her true bloodline. Her dark hair fell in soft, old Hollywood waves over one shoulder. She didn't look like a mob boss's granddaughter. She looked like a queen stepping down to inspect a conquered province. Amos moved forward automatically, opening the rear door of the center Maybach. He bowed his head slightly. You look stunning, Vivian. She paused by the door, her dark eyes sweeping over his immaculate tuxedo and the tense, rigid posture of his guards. She offered him a smile that did not reach her eyes. You clean up nicely when there's a gun pointed at your head, Mr. Russo. She slid into the plush leather seat. Amos swallowed his pride, rounded the car, and climbed in beside her. As the convoy pulled away toward the museum campus, the silence inside the cabin was thicker than the bulletproof glass protecting them. The mayor's platinum gala is highly publicized, Amos began, keeping his voice carefully modulated, acutely aware of the audio bug Lorenzo had undoubtedly planted in the vehicle. When we enter Stanley Field Hall, the press will be present. I will escort you to the head table. During the mayor's toast, I will request the floor. And what will you say? Vivian asked, turning her head to look at the passing city lights. She seemed entirely relaxed, unbothered by the gravity of the evening. I will tell them the truth, Amos said quietly. That I am an arrogant fool, that I insulted a woman of immeasurable grace, and that I spend every waking moment regretting it. Vivian finally looked at him. The ambient light from the street lamps washed over her face, highlighting the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw. Do you? Regret it? I regret that my temper blinded me, Amos answered honestly, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. I regret that I treated you like a pawn. Regardless of your last name, no woman deserves to be spoken to the way I spoke to you. Vivian studied him for a long, piercing moment, searching for the lie. Apparently finding none, she looked away. "We will see if your actions match your poetry, Amos." The Maybachs glided to a halt in front of the grand, neoclassical columns of the Field Museum. The red carpet was swarming with Chicago's elite, flashing cameras, and local politicians. As Amos's security detail cleared a path, the whispers began. Everyone recognized the Russo motorcade. Amos stepped out first, ignoring the blinding flash of the cameras. He turned, offering his hand. Vivian took it, her touch cool and firm. As she emerged, the murmurs of the crowd shifted from standard curiosity to pure, unadulterated shock. The socialites who had mocked her the night before froze. The judge's wife, the one who had bumped into Vivian and started the entire catastrophe, actually dropped her clutch, her jaw going slack. They recognized the girl, but they didn't recognize this terrifying, regal version of her. Nor could they comprehend why the most ruthless man in Chicago was escorting her with the careful reverence of a servant. Amos tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her up the marble steps. Inside Stanley Field Hall, the gala was in full swing, dwarfed only by Maximo, the massive titanosaur skeleton dominating the center of the room. The moment Amos and Vivian descended the grand staircase, the string quartet might as well have stopped playing. The room went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto them. Amos felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He hated being stared at. He hated being vulnerable. But he felt the phantom crosshairs on the back of his neck, and more surprisingly, he felt the steady, unwavering warmth of Vivian's hand on his arm. She wasn't trembling. She owned the room without speaking a single word. They took their seats at the head table. The mayor, sweating profusely under Amos's intense gaze, stammered through his welcoming speech. When he finally raised his glass for the traditional opening toast, Amos stood up. The clinking of glasses ceased immediately. Amos stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it with a steady hand. He looked out over the sea of billionaires, judges, and undercover cartel bosses. Then he turned his gaze to Vivian. "Last night, at a similar gathering, I made a grave, unforgivable error." Amos's voice boomed through the hall, resonant and commanding, yet laced with a bitter humility. "I allowed my arrogance and my temper to blind me to the grace of the people around me." Whispers erupted like wildfire. Amos Russo did not apologize. He destroyed. Yet here he was, publicly baring his throat. "I directed my cruelty toward a woman who showed me nothing but politeness," Amos continued, his eyes locked on Vivian's. "I judged her by the simplicity of her dress, and in doing so, I revealed the absolute poverty of my own character. I humiliated her in front of many of you in this very room." He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch. He stepped away from the podium and walked back to the head table, stopping in front of Vivian. In front of the cameras, the mayor, and the watching underworld, Amos Russo bowed his head deeply. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying perfectly through the quiet hall, "you are a woman of immense dignity. I am entirely unworthy of your forgiveness, but I humbly ask for it." "I am sorry." The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding frenzy. The shock in the room was palpable. Amos had just surrendered his crown to an unknown girl in a blue velvet dress. Vivian looked up at him. For a fraction of a second, the ice in her eyes melted. She saw the cost of what he had just done. In their world, reputation was armor, and Amos had just stripped his off and handed it to her. She reached out, her fingertips lightly brushing his forearm. "Your apology is accepted, Mr. Russo. Please, sit." Amos let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 24 hours. He had done it. He had satisfied the Don. He sat down, a strange, electric tension now thrumming between him and Vivian. But the night was far from over. At 10:30 p.m., the formal dinner concluded, and the guests moved toward the museum's upper balconies for cocktails. Amos was guiding Vivian through the crowd when a harsh, mocking voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Well, well, if it isn't the Reaper of Chicago, playing a bloody lapdog." Vincent Costa, a brutal rising boss from the South Side, stepped from behind a marble pillar. Flanked by 3 heavily armed men, Costa smirked, his eyes raking over Vivian with blatant disrespect. "I heard about your public groveling, Dom," Costa sneered, smelling of cheap cologne and violence. "Over some piece of charity trash? You've gone soft. Maybe I'll buy her for the night. Show you how a real—" Amos's blood ran cold. He didn't care about the insult. He cared about the sniper scopes that were undoubtedly shifting toward Costa. If bullets started flying, it would be a massacre. "Walk away, Vincent," Amos warned, his voice a lethal hum. "Now." Before Costa could laugh, Vivian moved. She stepped cleanly around Amos. The quiet elegance she had maintained all evening vanished, replaced by a cold, radiating authority. She tilted her head to look the towering brute in the eyes. "Vincent Costa," Vivian said, her voice suddenly flat and echoing with the exact terrifying timbre of Don Lorenzo. Costa blinked, caught off guard. "You launder your money through a shell corporation called Vanguard Logistics in the Cayman Islands," Vivian recited casually. "Your brother Paulie skimmed $2 million from the Mexican cartels last month, and you are currently hiding him in a safe house in Gary, Indiana." Costa's smirk vanished entirely. His face drained of all color. The FBI didn't even have this intelligence. Who the hell are you?" he stammered. Vivian smiled like a predator watching a rat. "My name is Vivian Romano, and you just offered to buy the blood of Don Lorenzo for the night." The name hit Costa like a physical blow. He staggered back in paralytic terror. Before he could beg, Vivian simply raised her hand and snapped her fingers once. From the shadows, 6 of Lorenzo's elite Praetorian Guard materialized. Within 2 seconds, Costa's 3 guards were disarmed and smashed quietly against the marble pillars. 2 guards seized Costa, immobilizing him. "Take him to my grandfather at the airfield," Vivian commanded smoothly. "Tell Don Lorenzo that Mr. Costa has volunteered to surrender his Southside armories as a gesture of goodwill. If he resists, kill him." They dragged the sobbing boss out through a side exit, so efficiently that the surrounding gala guests barely noticed. Vivian smoothed a wrinkle from her velvet dress, taking a deep breath. The lethal aura dissolved, and she turned back to Amos, taking a delicate sip of champagne. "I apologize for the interruption. You were doing so well." Amos let out a dark, mesmerized chuckle. The sheer terror of the last 24 hours was completely gone, replaced by a fiery, intoxicating obsession. She didn't need her grandfather's protection. She was the weapon. "You had me fooled," Amos murmured, closing the distance between them. He reached out, gently brushing a stray curl behind her ear. The quiet victim. It was a flawless mask. "I prefer peace, Amos," she replied, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous challenge. "But never mistake my preference for peace as an inability to wage war." "I never will again," Amos vowed. "Your grandfather commanded me to treat you like a queen tonight to save my life. But looking at you now, I'd burn my own city down just to see you wear the crown." A slow, genuine smile touched Vivian's lips. "Take me home, Amos. You survived tonight. Let's see if you can survive tomorrow." Amos offered his arm, his chest swelling with exhilarating pride. As he escorted Vivian Romano past the terrified whispers of the elite, he knew one thing for certain. The King of Chicago had just found his queen. Wow, what a phenomenal twist. Did you expect Vivian to handle Costa like an absolute boss? I am obsessed with this dynamic. Amos going from a ruthless bully to a captivated mafia king is everything. If you loved this dramatic conclusion, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below. What should we name Amos and Vivian's ship? Thanks for watching.